Hello and welcome to the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Top Gun Maverick gave us all a great reason to go back to the cinema this past summer. It was a huge commercial and critical success, and it has become the top grossing film of Tom Cruise's career. So we are very excited to bring you a conversation today about the sound of Top Gun Maverick with the movie's creative team. Joining us today are director Joseph Kosinski, supervising sound editors James Mather, Al Nelson, and Bjørn Schroeder, as well as re-recording mixers Chris Burdon and Mark Taylor. If you are one of the few people who didn't see the film when it came out, or if you just want to experience the magic again, it is streaming right now in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and I encourage you to check out the work of these great artists. It's always a pleasure when we can have directors on this show in conversation with their sound artists, and I wanted to take the opportunity to ask director Joe Kosinski what called to him about Top Gun, and why he wanted to revisit such an iconic film from over 3 decades ago.
I guess to go back to the beginning, I saw the first Top Gun as a 11-year-old kid in 1986. I know exactly where it was, in the theater in my hometown, and I think like everyone who saw it in May of 86, it blew me away, and it was something that just played all summer long. The music was on the radio. I had never seen a movie shot quite like that before. What Tony Scott did is pretty amazing, and it just became one of those films that became part of our culture. So that's that's where I first kind of became aware of it. Then, somehow found myself making a movie with Tom Cruise in 2012 called Oblivion, which is my own story. And we just had an incredible experience making that film together. Obviously there's some Top Gun elements in that film if you rewatch it now, certainly. And, Tom said we even talked about Top Gun, which I don't remember. I must have blanked it out or something. But the next time it came up was actually I was at Skywalker working with Al on Only the Brave in 2017. And Jerry Bruckheimer sent me a draft of a script called Top Gun 2 that he had been working on. And I read the draft, and it had some elements in it I liked. But I had some ideas about the direction I would be interested in taking it. So I went down to LA and met with Jerry and pitched him on a few of those ideas. And Jerry said, "This sounds great, but you really need to pitch it to Tom." And I was like, "Fantastic," and he said, "We got to go to Paris to where Tom is shooting Mission Impossible. And, we're going to get a little time with him between setups, but you got to pitch him this story." So flew to Paris with Jerry in May of 2017, had about 25 minutes with Tom. And I just kind of pitched him the 4 kind of main tenets of the film. The first and most important being the kind of emotional spine of the film, which is this relationship or reconciliation with Rooster, who is the son of his old wingman, and putting that reconciliation against a mission that would take them both deep into enemy territory. And I think as soon as I said that, I could see the wheels in Tom's head start to turn, because I think to that point, he resisted the idea of ever going back to this character for a lot of reasons. But the main one being he needed an emotional hook for himself to understand why go back to this character. So that I think got it going. Then I just pitched this idea of how we find Maverick, not in the traditional Navy, but in the outskirts, working on experimental aircraft and pushing the envelope like Chuck Yeager, in the right stuff. So that whole Dark Star sequence was something I pitched. Obviously, the idea of shooting it in camera, that's Tom, that's what Tom does. So I knew that was an essential element, and I had an idea of how we might be able to accomplish it, but there was a lot to figure out. And then finally I just said, we can't call it Top Gun 2. We gotta call it Top Gun Maverick, because it's his story. It's another rite of passage for him. And after hearing that, Tom, pulled out his phone and called the head of Paramount and said, "Get ready, we're going to make this movie." And that was now 5 years ago. And it was. It's been a total adventure, and I couldn't be more proud of the film and all the people who worked on it, as we'll find out today. But everyone just did an incredible job, and we're all just, I think, really proud of and relieved that the movie worked.
The movie definitely worked. Joe, you teed up something that I want to follow up on, which was this idea of shooting as much of the film as possible. You call it in camera. Yeah. I know that it would have been probably from a production standpoint much easier to shoot all the cockpit stuff on green screen and comp it all in after the fact. But you guys went a very different direction, and that was very important to you and to Tom. And I'm sure that it created all sorts of interesting issues for the sound team to deal with. And obviously, Mark Weingarten, who is the production sound mixer, it was an important part of that, and he couldn't join us today. But I would love for you and the team to talk about that, knowing that you wanted to capture as much of it live in camera as possible. How did you go about? Because another thing is, you could have just looped everything afterwards, right?
There was still a lot of looping. There's still a lot of looping. Yeah, that's the beauty of Top Gun, is everyone's wearing a mask. So, if you come up with a better idea, you can always change what someone said, which is great. And in fact, I think the first Top Gun, a lot of that dialogue, most of the movie was written after it was shot with that, nice little ability to do that. But, Mark did come up with a very compact digital recorder that was in the cockpit with all the actors while we were shooting this for real, that did get the dialogue on the day. It did get the efforts. There's some things, that you get in the moment that you just can't, you could never imagine. So even if we didn't use that dialogue, we had a reference of what it was like to try to speak when you're pulling 6Gs, and that's really valuable. But the truth of, flying in these airplanes is they're not that interesting to listen to when you're inside doing it. It looks spectacular, and it feels incredible. And from the outside, these jets are, deafening and have so much character, depending on, where it is relative to you and how fast it's moving. But from the inside, it's very much like riding on an airliner. It's that kind of constant hum. So a big challenge of this film was figuring out, okay, that's reality. So we've got this really, very realistic image that was captured, but how do we get the emotion that we want to feel from the soundtrack in this? And that is not easy. There was a lot of, obviously, work and effort from design through mixing to achieve that. And, luckily we've got a whole panel full of experts here to take us through that.
No, absolutely. No, I had it was a great catching up with Mark Weingarten after he was done with the shoot. And I know that he had a lot of challenges in the beginning just to get those recorders into the cockpit, because they had to go through a lot of different steps to ensure the safety. They had to make sure that they could still use the ejector seat just in case of an emergency. So like this little recorder had to eject with them. They had to be separate from the cameras. I think it was really important to Joe and Tom and everyone in the crew that they could kind of keep it simple, that they could basically trigger the recording, before they took off and do all the recordings. And I also knew once they came back and you guys checked all the rushes that Joe and you guys all just absolutely loved that sound that Mark created. And that was kind of like our guiding kind of position to make sure that we recaptured. As Joe mentioned, we did shoot quite a bit of ADR afterwards, but to just kind of keep that intensity. And we did little tricks, kind of playing it futz back to the actors. Joe and even Tom were quite involved to get the actors back into the ADR studio and kind of relive that moment, which is quite difficult because it's such a nice, warm, cozy, inviting, warm atmosphere. And like now you're trying to kind of pretend again that you're in that F-18 fighter jet kind of pulling multiple Gs. But I think we're very, very proud of how, this all kind of came to sound just like Mark's recordings. And then when the final mix went to Chris Burdon, I think one of the nice things that I think was achieved was the sound was kind of established, that it was like that intensity. But I think even like in the dogfight when they're training, I think Chris did such a beautiful job of just backing off enough that you're still connected to the dialogues. I think the beauty of this mix really is that at the end, you never really feel like you're disconnected from the dialogues, which is easy to do with that kind of intense, kind of, heavily treated, kind of distorted dialogue in the beginning. So I'm very, very proud of that fact.
Joe, you mentioned how quiet is in there. One of the things I was grateful for was the fact that when they hit record, there was no stopping and starting, take one, take two. It just recorded the whole thing. So one of the things we loved doing was just pouring through the production. And what I was looking for was anything that wasn't, just general hum, looking for any communications from the tower, beeps, Bitch and Betty, all of this stuff. And so there were all of these found treasures in the production that were either just references of what the pilots hear or actual usable material that we could plug in to make the inside of the cockpit realistic. Because in reality, that was what was happening in the jet. So it was actually a blessing that we had all of that, all those, gigabytes and terabytes of extra media to pour through to start to add to the track to add that complexity.
Yeah, it was always to get back to that kind of that real sound. I think that was the mantra from the beginning of the of post-production, that Joe, you really wanted us to get back to that feeling that we got from Mark's recording. And I think hopefully we achieved that.
The joy of the film is that it's so confident in its characters and characterization. You can use the anchor point of the real sound in the helmets and the cockpits, and then emotionally in certain scenes we were able to just back off and make sure you could hear the characters' voices, and it didn't ever feel like you weren't in there with them. And we could do that throughout the film. Early on in The Dark Star, there's actually quite a lot of distortion on Tom's voice early on, and Maverick's voice, and then it opens up when it just gets more emotional, and we could do that so confidently throughout the whole film because we were so lucky we had a story, the whole thing, we just believed it, and we could and it was great to do that. When there's the training run, you can just keep the character, the voices, because they all have great different voices up there, and if you just over distort it, you lose that. So we had the anchor points that we knew the sound that had been recorded. That's how we wanted to get as our core, but we could move and just adjust right throughout the whole film.
Yeah, it was great, Chris. Your the Coyote passing out was such a great moment in the film where you kind of backed off and you kind of just really went into his head. I just absolutely love that sequence, how it came out in the end of the final mix.
You guys are jumping around. I've got so many questions, but since you brought that up, that's one of my favorite sound moments in the film. Because I think one of my favorite uses of sound design is to give you the subjective experience of what a character is going through, and you did that so well with when Coyote passes out, and then there's that wonderful shot, Joe, that you designed where his plane drops below the mountain, and we don't know, and you also take the sound out at that point until it comes roaring back over the mountain, and it's so satisfying. But there's so I feel like we could just talk for an hour about that one specific sequence, because you're playing with dynamics and contrast, and the use of silence and quiet in this film is also really interesting to me. So, Joe, I would love to, maybe we could use this just as a case study, that particular scene of like how you thought about the scene, how you worked with the sound team to kind of shape and sculpt this experience.
Yeah, well, I think it's important here to talk about Eddie Hamilton, our editor, because what he did in the Avid, which, is kind of a temp guide for the film, it doesn't have the detail or the complexity or the nuance, obviously, that the the final has, but what is in that Avid is an intention and a creative idea of where we want it to go. So those ideas, or at least those broad moves, were things that Eddie was able to mock up in the Avid very well, and kind of, set the stage for these guys to do what they do best, and really bring it to life. So that's kind of where that idea started, for, that kind of subjective moment of Coyote passing out. The disappearing under the canyon, I mentioned earlier, that Oblivion had a lot of Top Gun moments in it. Well, this is a Oblivion moment in Top Gun, because we actually did this scene in Oblivion where Maverick disappears in the bubble ship, and we cut the sound and brought it right over top. So quoting ourselves a little bit there, but that's okay. You can do that, every once in a while. But it's definitely one of those moments in the mix where if you're watching it with the crowd, you can feel everyone hold their breath, because they really think, that we're going to pull a goose and kill one of the trainees. But we don't. Again, just perfect execution, by this team, in every respect, when it came to the final Atmos mix.
Joe, I would love for you to talk a little about, your philosophy of sound. I met you during Tron Legacy, which was the first time that you came up to. I used to run Skywalker. I was up there.
That's
that
right.
You came up and we worked together. We got to work together on that film, and you've been going back to Skywalker and working very, very consistently with the same artists. So I know that we've all worked with a lot of directors who kind of show up periodically through the final mix, watch a playback, give notes, disappear. Joe, I know that you're very involved. So can you talk a little about, I know that you got Al involved even before you went out and shot, and just talk about your philosophy of engaging the sound team and how you use this very powerful tool.
Yeah, I like to engage everyone as early as possible, as soon as I can, on a project, just to get them thinking about it. And, you can come up with a lot of great ideas in prep that can help you down the road. So for this one, when I told Al that, how we were going to shoot the film, he said, boy, I'd love to get out there and get some recordings as soon as possible. So I had done a couple days on the carrier early on in prep, and had experienced what it's like to be on a carrier. And unless you've done it, you just can't imagine the beautiful chaos / ballet of what's happening on a deck. And so I think we got Al out there with Benny Burt, I think in July or August of 2018, about a month before we started principal photography. I sent out Claudio, our DP, and some camera operators with a whole bunch of storyboards for the opening sequence. And I think we sent Al out and Benny with a bunch of recording equipment and basically recorded jets for a week out there. And it was it was so beneficial to have all that material early on, because as soon as you're assembling even your early footage, you've got a lot to work with. And Eddie had a tremendous library of stuff right from the beginning. So it was great to have that early on, and great to start to get a feel for what the movie was gonna be like.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I'm so grateful that Joe and Tommy Harper and the production were eager to kick it off so early and give us that opportunity. As Joe says, the carrier it's an overwhelming, dangerous and remarkable scenario. You've got 5,000 people on an island floating in the Atlantic, and you've got everything happening all at once. And in this particular situation, it was the first time that F-18s and F-35s were actually launching together, which was really cool. This was something the Navy had never done before from a carrier. On top of that, you've got Claudio and their team shooting these sequences. So it was the whole carrier was abuzz. And yes, the main goal, which we were gratefully successful with, was to just get as much material as possible. Definitely F-18s, got F-35s. There's all kinds of other sounds that you wouldn't imagine that are just fantastic and useful in both in their literal representation, but also as just sound design sweeteners. Everything from the dry fire of the catapults to the cable room below deck where the jets are landing, and then these cables, through hydraulics tighten and loosen, and all of these various tanks and purges and doors and winds and the PAs are amazing, and the sounds when the boat turns around. So all these other things happening, and then another wonderful part of this early expedition was all the R&D. And that was with interacting with the women and the men there in the Navy, and in particular the pilots. One of the things, I had actually been on a carrier back about 10 or 15 years before then, and I kind of had an idea, but I never really got to understand what it's like to be in the cockpit of a jet, of an F-18. And this was an opportunity to really sit down with a lot of those pilots and other crew members and ask a lot of questions. And one of the great things was to just, we would at lunch or dinner sit with these pilots, and their rule was, it was always a round table, and there's no limit to the number of people you can get at a round table. And so there's this camaraderie that you experience right away. And that's something that I think is reflected so well in the film. And so all these pilots just keep piling in, and there's always more room because it's a round table. And so we would ask them things like, okay, what does it sound like up there? And, is it beeping a lot? Is it not beeping a lot? And, we turn that off, but we always listen to Bitchin' Betty. She tells us what to do. And,
Wait. What is Bitchin' Betty?
Yes. You take that one out.
So, they're in these jets, and the jets are very advanced. They can actually fly themselves for a lot of it. But of course, the pilots, they want to drive. So the first thing they do is they get in there, and there's all these altimeters and all that can beep or not beep, but they turn most of that off. So it's just you and the tower communicating, and you're flying along. But, and so they kind of know what's going on. But if you hear this woman with this Southern accent interrupt you, that's Bitchin' Betty. And if she says pull up, you better pull up or it's your ass. And that was something I wasn't aware of. And, had we done the research online, I would have eventually found that, it's definitely out there. And it's existed for a while in many, many aircraft in the Navy. But the idea is that back in the day, they needed something more than just a beep, 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 because you don't know, is that, are my tires flat or am I about to crash and burn? So the idea was that they would have this voice that would interrupt and say, pull up, altitude, engine fire left, engine fire right, etc. And they actually auditioned a bunch of different voice talents. And in the end, it was, someone who worked at Lockheed who had this, this woman who had this Southern accent. She said, pull up, engine fire left, engine fire right. And I just thought that was amazing. And it's such a familiar thing to the pilots. And it's something that they know to listen to. So that was it was one of many opportunities to interact with the pilots, get an idea of what it's like to be a fighter pilot in these, massive machines. So many other things that you experience on that aircraft carrier, including the feel of the jets, but getting to know the people that become our characters was, I think, instrumental in kind of investing yourself a little bit more in the film and the story.
Al, I would love to hear you just address really quickly, like the technical aspect of getting field recordings in that kind of environment. Because I've only listened to the Blue Angels during Fleet Week in San Francisco, but I can say that's probably one of the loudest sounds I have ever heard in my entire life. And how do you actually get good recordings of something that has that much signal?
Well, you bring Benny Burr. We brought a lot of gear and a lot of 30 dB pads, which are these things that take the level and they suppress it the preamp so that you're not hitting your recorder. And we recorded everything digitally. one thing I knew this time that I had experienced last time in the carrier when I went to the Nimitz back in 2003 was there's all of this radio technology and telemetry and all of these things that are going on that are, who knows what they're doing to our insides, but whenever you would point your microphone in particular directions, you'd get this crazy feedback and garbled noise. So we kind of tried to prepare for that. And then, the levels. And the one thing that I think we were successful at, and kudos to Mark Taylor and Chris and James and the UK team who did this final Atmos mix. But the one goal was that you wanted the track to feel like to feel a jet the way a jet really feels when you're that proximal to it. And it hits you in the gut. It's just this intense level of low end and power. And so we used a lot of pads and a lot of gear to record lots of material. And the other thing you learn to do is you learn to embrace distortion. The jets are literally distorting the air. And so in the beginning, I was going through and I was going, oh gosh, I can't use this. It's clipping. And you start to realize, no, that's the sound. When they have something called there's military power and then there's combat power, and that's when they actually use the afterburners. So these jets, these F-18s, get on the deck and the barrier goes up, and they just go in full thrust, and then they hit the afterburners, and it's just this wall of power. And that final scene before they launch off the carrier, that's both production, right, Chris? That has production in it, and it also has our sounds in it. And, it's just this massive wall. And the goal is to have the theater feel like the carrier, which I think they were very successful at reproducing. One last little side note that I realized after the fact, for those of you that are going to go record jets, is I had, like 50 dB of suppression on my recorder, and I'm down there with earplugs and headphones because it's like 180 dB of sound, not including what you're feeling. And Benny and I are down there right below these jets that are launching. And I would pull my microphone close to me. I go, okay, this is an F-18. It's going to launch in combat power. Not realizing. So then I load up my recordings and I have no idea what anything is because I'm bloody whispering into my microphone when I should have been screaming. And so what I would do is I would go and I would gain all my slates up like 80 dB so I could understand whether it was an F-35 or an F-18 and whether it was combat or military power. And so that was a lesson learned on the back end.
That's really funny. Well, you brought up something that I think is really important to acknowledge, which was just the level of access and cooperation that you got from the Navy to allow you to go into these spaces and do all of this stuff. And you talked about the pilots. I can imagine that they were excited to help because a lot of them, I'm sure, got into the military because of the first movie, right?
Yeah, high fives down the hallways. You'd be walking down with your, microphone and the Top Gun, yeah, high five. And, they were eager to tell stories and to sit and chat with you. Everybody, not just the pilots, but I had meetings with the medical officers, the CO, who else? The onboard priest or the
chaplain.
The chaplain, yeah. Great stories. So everybody was so eager to see this film being made in just this instance. And, there was all kinds of other instances going on throughout. I think the Navy was not just happy to do it because it shows them in a great light, but also just because it really is, it's just a great legacy from the 86 film, and to see that being created again, I'm sure everybody was very, very excited.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the collaboration between the Skywalker team and the UK team. I mean, obviously, Joe, I know that the original intention, you've been going up to Skywalker for a long time. I know you guys, the Skywalker team was going to go to London to do the mix because that's where the producers were. But then that was right when COVID was starting, right? And it feels naive to even think this, but remember back in March of 2020 when we thought that COVID was only going to be a few weeks?
Yeah, that's exactly why we needed felt the need to continue the mix. So yeah, we were halfway through, or maybe just wrapping up pre-mixes at Skywalker in March of 2020, and COVID hit and shut everything down. Very quickly after that, we realized we had to push our release date. Naively, we pushed it, all the way to the fall, or even maybe it was Christmas of 2020. And we still had a film to finish, but no way to mix it. There literally was no stage that would open for us over here. And then, Tom and Eddie and Jerry found a stage in the UK at Twickenham, and more importantly, a team that I believe had worked on Fallout, if I'm not mistaken, as well as maybe not all on Fallout, but had all worked with Tom at some point in the past, and most importantly with Eddie, who would kind of be there in person every day, our editor. This, A++ mixing team that was available to save us essentially and continue this process. So, usually you would think it would be very hard for something like this to be handed over to another team and continue. But I think, we had such we had done 3 temp mixes at this point. We had such a strong idea of what the mix should be, but, weren't able to finish it. But these guys took it on and just, not only finished it, but I just think took it to another level in the finish that was really spectacular. And, it's just one of those cases of just having an incredible group of people pull together in a situation where you need to finish it, and just delivered a spectacular mix. So it was very interesting to be, monitoring I had to monitor from Fox, a stage at Fox here in Los Angeles, basically alone or with one other person in there wearing masks and gloves and everything. But we found a way to get through it, and just, left no stone unturned. And in some ways, the pandemic allowed us to make sure that, the time wasn't an issue. We did everything, and this is true to the mix, and this is true to the visual effects and the color timing and everything. We really had the time to get it exactly right for a release that, never happened. And then, we held the movie for 2 years, but we knew it had been done and to the best of our ability. So yeah, these guys should definitely talk about their perspective of picking it up and running with it on the other side.
The evolution of this movie, every movie is an evolution in its own life. It has its beginning and its end. The evolution of this is still extraordinary. You couldn't write this. You've got people invested in the DNA of the history of the film, then the DNA of the world that the film was made about, and then the DNA of making something to match the expectations, or even come close to the expectations about the American dream. And then you got a bunch of limeys in the UK to finish it. I mean, nobody's going to write that script. I'm just saying, it's not. But I know from working with Tom that all he wants is to feel it. He's just got to feel it. And in the absence of everybody else being there, Eddie could steer us as best he could, and he always does an incredible job. His ear for sound is really admirable, and we follow it. But when Tom comes in the room and he starts jumping up and down, that's good. Okay, that's good. And when Tom says, guys, I'm not feeling it. And you're like, okay. And you look at Chris, it's a music cue. Are you feeling it? And Chris is like, oh, well, I was feeling it. That's what it's like. But no, I'm not feeling it. No, Tom, you're right. No, let's just. So we all have that dance that we love. And we were blessed to have the opportunity to have that dance on this movie and feel it all the way through.
Yeah, Chris and Mark, I would love to hear about like what was that mixing process like for you? You guys were at Twickenham. Joe was listening remotely from Fox in LA, thousands of miles away. It's probably not the optimal way of mixing and working with a director, but talk about the challenges of doing that and how you addressed it.
Like we said, having Eddie there was amazing. Having Chris go through and do a pass of the music beforehand was also really helpful for me. And drilling in the mantra of protecting the dialogue at all costs, which I think I did. And then just having some fun with it. Sometimes we were allowed to go to 11. We were reined in, but, Eddie would say, well, let's give it a try. So we did. And, we slowly temper it back down to where it should be. But it was just good fun. It was good fun. And, just going through, I can remember, like I had a little cutting room off to the side, and I would go and sit and just listen to all the tracks in isolation whilst Chris was doing a music pass, learning what was there really and what kind of elements I could use when we got to things like the Canyon Run, where when Tom told us to turn it down, we did turn it down, but we didn't turn everything down. We got these lovely kind of distorted jet buys and the movement of the cockpit and stuff, which we could maintain to keep the presence of the jets without losing the interiors. And then when we cut to the exteriors, then I was allowed to have it, as it were. So.
quite amazingly too.
Thank you.
It's a great sequence.
It is. It's my favourite sequence.
I mean, the communication from the get-go to sort of getting the phone call where I go downstairs, having had the phone call from Paramount saying, I think I've just been asked to work on Top Gun, and the excitement. And then that was a period of time. And I don't know exactly how long. We just used that time through James and communicating with Al and Bjørn, getting our schedule when we knew that we'd get a hold of the Pro Tools sessions. And then, because it is about, some of us have been doing this quite a long time, and you have your own way of approaching it. And we had these pre-mixed sessions from Chris Boyes and Gary Summers that we had to just adapt to our way. But we did have a nice amount of time to just a few days here and a few days there, the building up to the schedule to actually get in the theatre. So we could, and Simon Chase and I would talk through getting a method for, again, the distortions and so on, and getting that into my template and so on. And I knew that Mark in parallel was looking at sessions, getting his bus structure, all the sort of technical stuff, lining it up and feeling then we were going to be ready to go. Again, I had a lovely few days, 2 or 3 days. Eddie, again, this is referencing back to what Joe said, that we had this guiding shape in the Avid. And again, when we spoke to Eddie, that would be, again, this transitional point. We'd discuss that, and he'd say, just reference that. If he's not in the room, just reference it for shape. And it would be, we'd want to take it and burn that, give it all what we're hearing there and use it. And he just, again, I had the 3 days on the music, and it was a follow on from something he said many times over the years. On Mission Impossible, I mixed, make it the best Atmos mix musically you've ever done. We didn't go particularly gimmicky on this mix in terms of loads of extra excessive spinning things around the surrounds and the overheads. I think I think it's because we just knew the story. We knew what we wanted to approach was just so focused anyway, but I obviously enjoyed all of that on the music mix. And I've told this story before. I was just sitting in the room at Twickenham doing music on my own, and just hairs standing up on the back of my neck, sequence after sequence. And just, Cecile Tournesac, brilliant music editor, was in there taking the latest stuff from Lauren Balfe and right back through all the Hans Zimmer and Faltermeyer stuff. And I was just kind of so privileged and felt I couldn't quite believe this was I was being paid to do this. It was so we had this transition, and then we kind of hit the ground running, and we'd have a few days. We had the first few days before we saw Tom and Chris turned up. I feel sad, that Joe's so far away, and you had to just wait, and there would just be this 24-hour turnaround, and the notes would come back, and I feel sorry. We were in there like pigs in shit, the proverbial, but Joe would have to wait, and then we'd get the feedback. And I hope it was fun that you're seeing what we did and hearing what we did, but we were in the thick of it and just hopefully sending it and getting the feedback, and we enjoyed getting the notes, and we were confident that we could do them and so on. But it was unusual that filmmakers were spread across the universe for us.
Chris, I just want to say, I'm not sure if it's a share with everyone, but one of my favorite, and it's such a simple moment, and we always get close to it, but the musically, I thought when we have the dark star and we kind of go up in the sky and we see that that wide shot, and the dark star kind of screams across and with our planet below, and you have that beautiful transition to the music. That's probably my second favorite moment in the whole film. And it's just so beautifully mixed with that final music cue that came in. So I absolutely loved that moment.
He felt that one. One.
We all felt that one. Thank you. Yeah.
When you've got visuals like that, again, it was just such a joy because it felt natural, even though mixing can be difficult. And we had real moments of like the opening sequence, just feeling it. Tom and Chris just totally feeling that we were right in the ballpark there. We had the moments that, like James is referring to, the training sequence had a music cue that Tom came in and felt he couldn't hear any of the dialogue. And that was like... And then we changed the cue, and Cecile went off. They recut the sequence a little bit to tighten, and we had the Who in there. And again, all these iconic moments in that track, which I remember as a kid, and trying to play the organ bit on a synthesizer, and there it is in front of me, and it's cut so beautifully, so quickly, that you just have Roger Daltrey just being the backdrop, and then all of dialogue's working, and it's like, thank you very much, we'll go with that. So but there were moments
but everything worked with a rhythm. The cut, the shots, the cut, the sound, the music, everything ended up working. I can't think of a film that I've done where it has a rhythm and a pattern to it, where a smile is as poignant as a frown, is as poignant as the drum beat, is as poignant as everything. It just worked like the perfect piston running on a machine. It was just, and that's not any individual. That is en masse. It is the sum of its parts. It was I watch it now and I'm still choked in places, because when something works, it works every time. And everybody from the guy that took the chocks out from the plane to the guy that printed the last DCP, it's quite an extraordinary thing, I think.
I agree with you. And I just, watching the film again, I was just struck by the way it was structured, and Joe, how you worked with the screenplay writers and just built this script that kind of modulated in tone so much and gave such a rich, I just made a note to myself, back to back, this extended, we talked about Coyote passing out from the G-forces, that whole moment. Then you go into the bird strike, they eject. Then the next moment is the confrontation between Maverick and Rooster, and then Ice's funeral, and then Maverick gets fired. It's like just moment after, intense emotional moment after moment, but also a lot of modulation, and there's some music in some of that, and some of it dies back. And I love the way you really just, Joe, you really just took the audience on a journey through this, and the sound really reinforced that.
Yeah, the funeral was one that I remember from the first time, even in the Avid, mocking up the idea of using the actual bugle player on the day when we shot that at Point Loma Cemetery, going into Harold Faltermeyer's cue from the first film, taking us through, Maverick going to Cyclone, then Maverick going to Penny. That was one of those sequences I remember just from very early on, just working in the Avid beautifully. I'm glad that all works for you. When you talk about stuff like that, I would like to say we got it right the first time, but I shot 2 additional scenes that were between the crash and Maverick confronting Rooster. There were 2 scenes that we shot that went between those 2 moments. in the original screenplay and the way we shot it. And, it only worked when we pulled those out. And, it's and the Who, someone mentioned how great the Who works. That was the 60th track that we tried over that sequence. There was so much iteration, so much trial and error, so much getting it wrong the first time and going back and trying again. But in the end, I guess it's like they say, filmmaking, it's with much effort, making it feel effortless. And that's really the case here. A lot of work, a lot of trial and error, knowing that we had to get it right because it was Top Gun. Tom said from the beginning, Joe, this is going to be like hitting a bullet with a bullet, which is, quite, something you want to hear on the first day from Tom. But as it's been referred to, it really was a true passionate effort by everyone who worked on it. And I think hopefully you feel that in the final product. And we all, at least I had a blast making it, as hard as it was. It was really, really fun. I can't believe I got the opportunity to do it. And I couldn't be more proud of all the people that worked on it and made it what it is.
That's great. Well, you guys have been very patient. We're at the end of our time, but I do want to give. Sometimes when we have a group like this, we like to go around and give everybody just a chance to mention their favorite sound moment in the film. Something that when the movie plays, just kind of makes you feel all giddy inside, or brings back a fun memory. And Bjørn, you mentioned something, but I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to pick one sound moment that makes you particularly joyous when the movie rolls by. Al, you want to kick us off?
I have many moments. Mostly it was the ones where we finally got that. Yes, that's it. I do love the canyon run. You can't beat that. The 215, and then I think it's Payback who goes. No, it's Hangman who goes. Damn. So yeah, great moment. And seeing it in the theaters. That's my favorite sound moment.
I agree with you heartily on that. Bjørn, what about you?
Oh gosh, I already mentioned both of them. Of course, the canyon run, I think we all love because it's such a great sequence that showcases all the the different nuance of our sound work. But I also love the moment when Rooster saves Maverick, and then Maverick runs over to him and kind of pushes him over in the forest, and that's just kind of that lighthearted comedy moment. It's such a great kind of relief for the audience too, and I really enjoyed it. It was such a subtle thing, but it's one of my favorite parts of the film.
Chris, how about you?
I'm going to probably go for the canyon run, although there's many. It's because the way I could be a bit more specific. There are many elements of that, all the way it builds. Because you realise that the guys watching, the pilots watching, are watching a screen, a graphic, and it feels like they are. So every time you cut, the cutting back and forward is just so wonderful, because you never think, oh, they're just watching like a graphic going through. They're in there with it, the way they move forward, the way they move back. And again, sorry, Mark, I'm going to talk about the music. No, it's the way but it's because of the effects and because of all the way the dynamic builds in the whole sequence. The music just reveals beautifully, and it goes and keeps going. So even 2/3 of the way through, when one of my favorite shots, which is the beautiful shot, Joe, of the low level shot across the desert. I think it may be in the top 2-3 shots. I don't know. I love it so much. And the music is starting to reveal at that point, and you get the thematic thing is starting to build, and you've still got a place to go, and I didn't have to go full level there, and it just rises until the wonderful sort of release of air, and then the single or two voices in the control room with all the pilots. So there you go. Yeah, 215. Sorry,
Mark. How about you?
Well, I would say the canyon run, but I also love the opening. And I was working with a guy who I was wearing my Top Gun hat, and he said, "Did you work on Top Gun?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm really looking forward to it." And I said, "If you don't get goosebumps in the first 20 seconds, I'll buy your ticket." And he hasn't contacted me, so I assume he liked it. But I think it was really well done. I love the music, obviously, Chris. I just, that would be my second favorite, because obviously McCannon's first. But
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because one of the things that struck me about the movie as well is, like, you know, James, you talked about acknowledging and the DNA of the original and the movie. I mean, from the get-go, Joe, like, you use the same font for the titles. Like, we have, you know, it's Don Simpson's presentation credit with Jerry Bruckheimer, you know, like, and you use that iconic theme music, and then we go right into Danger Zone. And so, like, you know, from the very beginning that we're going to be steeped in the DNA of the original, but you also weren't a slave to it, you know, like, this is a very fresh film and it tells a very different story. And I thought you just balanced that so beautifully.
Yeah. I mean, I always wanted the opening of the film to tell the audience, don't worry, we love Top Gun as much as you do. Like, you're going to be okay. We're going to take, this is a Top Gun movie. So I always loved the idea that the first few minutes of it, felt like Top Gun, but then obviously you're on a modern carrier. You're seeing F-18s, you're seeing F-35s. And very quickly, you know, as Maverick pulls into China Lake Naval Air Station and we reveal the Dark Star, you see that we're going to take you in another direction. You know, this is not the Top Gun you remember. But yeah, I just couldn't resist. I couldn't resist the Simpson Bruckheimer logo, having grown up seeing that, you know. And yeah, it's fun. It's fun to watch that first few minutes with an audience. You can just kind of feel it, that the anticipation.
Absolutely. James, what about your favorite scene?
First 10 minutes, it's a film of its own. At the moment when the Dark Star goes off in a puff of that first 10 minutes, done. I'm in. I'll sit here for 5 hours. But being a soft old git, I think the moment where you cross between the crash flashbacks and Penny sees Maverick through the window and she recognizes that this isn't Mav, there's somebody else there. And the music changes between Great Balls of Fire and the score from The Thing. I hate to say it, but I have not yet shed a tear at that moment. I'm an old softie, but that is storytelling at its peak. That's it. That's Maverick right there.
Joe, I hate to put you on the spot, but you got to pick one favorite moment.
Boy, that's tough. You know, I'll go with a moment that was, you know, again, it was something discovered in editorial. The script wasn't written. It wasn't written in structurally. It wasn't even two scenes that were supposed to go next to each other. But it's, for me, it's the music, the sound, and the image of this cut that I was always really, really proud of. And that's from the moment in the film with Mav when he's embracing Penny on the beach before having to go to battle, and the cut to the bow of the Teddy Roosevelt carving through the ocean. That moment with Hans's score there, taking us from Act 2 to Act 3, for me is one of those moments that I just, you know, for me kind of just worked.
That's great. Gentlemen, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure taking the time to talk with you guys about Top Gun Maverick. Really appreciate you all coming on the Dolby Institute podcast and telling us about how you made this remarkable achievement. Congratulations to all of you.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you to Joe, James, Al, Bjorn, Chris, and Mark for joining us today to talk about Top Gun Maverick. And thank you to our friends at Paramount and Skywalker Sound for helping put this conversation together. As I mentioned up top, Top Gun Maverick is streaming now in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, so please check that out. But before you go, please make sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, thanks again for joining us. This has been the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines, and our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thank you for listening.